In 2007, a team of archaeologists upended everything we thought we knew about the structure at the top of this hill. West Kennet Long Barrow had collapsed, perhaps even as quickly as within a lifetime of its first use. And this flew in the face of everything I thought I knew about this monument. Interestingly though, that collapse certainly wouldn't be the last time West Kennet Long Barrow was changed significantly in some way, modified, defaced, robbed, and eroded over thousands of years. Well, for me this changes how I see this Long Barrow completely, because if it was falling after a generation or two after it was first used, then it wasn't necessarily built to last forever, and yet it's still here. And when I come here and enjoy this place, West Kennet Long Barrow, well, I see a static tomb built by a group of people set there to last forever. But the truth behind this place, the truth behind West Kennet Long Barrow is so much deeper. See, what we see here today in this Long Barrow isn't necessarily what we look like in the first instance, almost certainly not what we see here today. It was a result of change, sometimes unnoticeable, sometimes monumental. Now, when we start to look at those changes in a little bit of detail, well, all of a sudden we lose that image of a static tomb that I envisaged, and instead we're looking at a rather unhinged time capsule. Now, in a time long before, predominantly the landscape would have looked a lot like this, predominantly heavily forested, and the people that lived here, well, they would have been considered the hunter-gatherers of the day, leading a nomadic lifestyle. We have very little evidence for their rituals, their religions, and even their homes, however temporary. However, things were about to change from this to something very different. From what is now mainland Europe, we start to see a fairly quick movement of the new Stone Age people, the Neolithic. Now, ancient DNA does show limited genetic continuity between the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and the incoming Neolithic farmers. The hunter-gatherers were almost certainly completely replaced by the Neolithic people. And with that movement of people, we start to see one of the biggest changes in the British landscape. We start to farm. We start to see agriculture, growing crops. We start to domesticate animals, cattle, sheep, goats. We start to see permanent settlements, and we start to see with that something else. Monuments. Monuments of place. This is West Kennet Long Barrow. It's 100 metres long and maybe 15 to 20 metres wide. It's huge. This construction is directly associated with the movement of people from the continent, the Neolithic. Around 3800 BC, we start to see these erected, a lot of these. We do have thousands remaining today, although many have been lost over the years, eroded, damaged, robbed out, or simply lost to the plough. They come in many different forms, built from stone, timber, earth, some chambered, some not, some very rectangular, some more tail-shaped. Today's story though is specifically about this one, West Kennet Long Barrow. And so we have this long mound, carefully shaped with stone chambers, set into its eastern core and a formal forecourt. This, like so many other long barrows we see today, required planning, labour and a shared understanding of what it was meant to be. All that effort, it didn't behave in the way I once assumed these monuments did, which is why what happens next, but how it was used and altered and eventually ended up like we see it today, matters far more than the fact that it was built at all. Okay, so this part of the story is one that makes me, and probably you to a degree, feel a little bit uneasy. Because between the 17th and the 19th centuries, people were fascinated by West Kennet. They didn't yet know how to look after it. This was an age of curiosity, of digging without recording and removal without any consequence. But then I guess without these people, we know very little about this site at all. It's a delicious double-edged sword of madness. The first real glimpse comes from John Albury. He sketches what he calls a barrow without a name, and he notes stones on one side and describes it as half a yard high. His drawing shows stones all the way around the mound, which immediately raises a question. Was he even looking at West Kennet Long Barrow at all? Because that doesn't add up with what we see today. I can't see it's changed for the good since then. John Aubrey gives us a fleeting but really frustrating glimpse into what he saw. 1685, and we know people are now digging into this. One of those culprits is Dr. Toop from Marlborough, later known as Dr. Took, and he finds some bones. And what do you think he exactly does with those bones? He turns them into medicine. I stored myself with many bushels, he wrote, of which I made a noble medicine that relieved many of my distressed neighbours. That single sentence seems to sum up the era perfectly for me. Bones as a remedy, archaeology here acting basically as a quarry. So whatever information those remains held, well, it's now gone forever. But in steps William Stukely, and we always have mixed feelings about him. However, first of all, he condemns what's been done here before and the damage. He writes that Farmer Green, the same Dr. Took, had miserably defaced the barrow by digging halfway into it. In 1725 he sketched the monument again, calling it the South Long Barrow because of how it sits within the Avebury landscape. And you can see why he condemns what has been done. Look at this southern side here. Stukely estimates its length at 320 feet, and he describes the stones at the eastern end. And of course he then says, well, actually this was Druids, unequivocally. And he gets that interpretation wrong, but that's okay, because Stukely records it, he documents it, he draws it, and he cares for it. He does very Stukely stuff. By 1814, Sir Richard Colt Hall was trying to make sense of what remained. He was searching for meaning, and what strikes him the most about West Kennet is the total absence of bronze weapons, especially telling compared to the round barrows he was excavating elsewhere. He doesn't solve the puzzle, but he's starting to notice a pattern. The shape here may well matter. By the mid-19th century, well, the damage continued, and Dr. Mayer, he concludes that there hasn't been much damage to this beautiful monument, the Southern Barrow, which it was referred to. Tenants had stripped off turf. A wagon road had been cut straight through it. The sides were dug for flint and chalk rubble. And then in 1859, John Furman tried to excavate properly, but the landowner refused permission to remove or move the stones. Furman is limited on what he can excavate. He finds an infant skull, 5 adult burials, pottery, flint, and he knows there's more. But he has to stop. Now this is a good place for this part of the journey to end, because all of a sudden people are starting to ask the right questions, and they actually realise how much of this has been lost already. By the 1950s, West Kennet Long Barrow had entered a very different phase of its story. When Stuart Piggott, working alongside Richard Atkinson, excavates the barrow in 1955 and 56, the focus now shifts towards carefully recording and structure. Now, for the first time, the chambers were properly cleared, the passageway was properly understood, and for the first time we're now thinking that what's inside these needs to be analysed properly rather than just collected as trophies. What Piggott uncovers is extraordinary. 5 chambers, a long stone-lined passage, disordered human remains in every chamber representing men, women, children and infants, pottery spanning different traditions and eras, animal bones mixed with human bone, signs of bodies were placed, moved, rearranged, and crucially thick layers of chalk and rubble sealing the chambers. So Piggott realised this place wasn't used just once and then forgotten. It had a really complicated internal history. But here's the problem, because Piggott wasn't just excavating this place. In the end, he would be putting it back together. But with what knowledge? We don't necessarily know. Perhaps his knowledge of others in the area. But it was just being put back together, cement here, reconstructed here. This is maybe how it would have looked. And while this saved the monument, it also froze one particular version of West Kennet in place. A necessary decision perhaps, but one that removed evidence of collapse for now. Piggott even imported sarcens from the local downs and put them here, so a lot of what you see today isn't even the original that would have been here. Working with dating methods of the time, Piggott concluded that West Kennet Long Barrow had been in use for centuries. The disorder of the bones made sense within that framework. Long-term use and repeated visits. It was careful interpretation built on honesty from what he could see and what the science of the time allowed. All this relied on this assumption that would later prove perhaps a little bit flimsy, the assumption that this monument had survived pretty well intact through a significant part of its early life. Those 1950s excavations were hugely important. Stuart Pigott had pushed the understanding of this place forward more than anybody had done so before. The success of those excavations, though, was based on that story, that one of the stable monument. Long use and slow change. It would take another half century and a completely different way of reading time to realise that some of those foundations weren't as solid as the stones put here. And that is where the story turns once again. So along comes 2007 and something quite important happens. We start to consider, in a dating sense, what has already been removed from the site. Bone, charcoal, the fragments that had been boxed, labelled and archived since 1950s. Radiocarbon dating and the modelling thereafter allowed those samples to be placed into a sequence with far greater precision than Pigott had ever had available to him. Not just dates but duration. How long activity lasted for, how clustered together events are. Actions that were once thought to be centuries, well, they now began to shrink down. The dated material from West Kennet clusters, the primary human remains, fell consistently within the later 37th century BC, most likely beginning around 3670 to 3650 BC. Individuals from different parts of these chambers all sit within overlapping date ranges. Men, women, children, infants, repeated use, all within the same span. Some chambers may have been active at roughly the same time, some ever so slightly offset, but we are measuring now in decades, not in centuries. Whatever was happening here was shared, coordinated and remembered by people who likely knew one another. Sites like Hazelton North and Ascot under Whitewick show similar patterns, tightly dated primary burial phases that did not last long. Then come later dates after this initial collapse and material associated with this sort of infilling and sealing of that first phase. Well, that comes a generation or two later, perhaps in the mid 36th century BC. These dates are no longer tied to complete bodies laid out in chambers, but to disarticulated bone, charcoal and material caught within chalk rubble. At this point, new burials appear to stop. We're now talking about people dealing with what is already there. The collapse after this first phase and the infill became part of the same story. Access became more restricted and chambers were stabilised, sealed or simply made unusable. What's striking for me is how short this whole arc appears to be. The construction, the use and then the structural failure all sit within a time frame perhaps of no more than 50 to 100 years. After that, later material does exist. Beaker pottery in secondary contexts, scattered artefacts, but it no longer belongs to the same sequence. West Kennet Long Barrow was built and constructed and used within a very tight time frame for its original purpose. We have this family of people in there, like we see at perhaps Knotgrove, a whole family tree revealed to us by DNA. And then it stopped, and it stopped being used for that original purpose. What follows is an aftermath of interaction only, really, rather than a burial. I'm not suggesting for a second that this is the story. With every long barrow we see, of course, we don't know until we do more DNA tests and more excavations in a very careful and obviously archaeological way. We're simply never going to know if this was the case, but I've got a funny feeling this might not be unique. Just under a decade on, West Kennet Long Barrow is approached once again. Nothing invasive, no digs, just a watching brief. This is a hugely important document for me because not only does it summarise the antiquarian madness, but it also gives us huge insight into how archaeology works today. For me, this place is a honeypot site for sure. It gathers hundreds of people per day and maybe thousands at the weekend. It's great. Stuart Pigott we have probably to thank for that, but perhaps not in the way we would like. The watching brief is brutal. Just have a look at some of these paragraphs. It doesn't dispute Pigott's excavation record, but it does highlight its limits in quite a harsh way. The 1950s work was described as having permanently altered this monument. Collapses rebuilt, stones reset and the mound remodelled. Evidence for slumping and collapse and later disturbance can no longer be seen because it was removed, stabilised and just tidied away. Now the layers here that might once have helped us untangle the sequence is gone. The report makes it clear that what survives now is a monument filtered through restoration, and that many of Pigott's conclusions were formed without dating methods capable of testing duration or pace. And in that sense, the watch and brief probably really does the job perfectly. It acknowledges that sometimes the best responsibility, the best actions that we can take are simply to record, monitor, and then step away. When I stand at West Kennet Long Barrow, what strikes me most is how absurd its history really is. The place is just one among thousands built early, and changed very early too. Guessed at, quarried, restored, argued over, you name it. It has absorbed centuries of attention and interference, and there's very real chance that it has now given up pretty much every secret it ever will do. I don't think any technology we discover in the next 100 years or so, in my opinion, is going to coax any more secrets out of this place just yet. And yet I don't feel disappointed by that. West Kennet Long Barrow doesn't need to keep revealing itself to be important in the landscape. It doesn't even need to look exactly how it once did. Pickett didn't put it back as it was, we know that. But what stands here now is a version that first pulled me in. The shape, the size, the invitation to be able to step inside this place and ask questions. I've been coming here for decades, and it's not perfect, and perhaps that's the whole point. It didn't need to be perfect, it still drew me in. So in the end, this Long Barrow changes things in two ways. Its early collapse tells us how brief and fragile the first phase may well have been, and everything that followed, the digging, the mistakes, the care, the restoration, the complete madness, shows how archaeology itself has grown up around places like this. West Kennet didn't just shape the past, but it helped shape how we try and understand places like this.